Let's talk about work attitudes. That's how to measure what people think and feel about their work. We'll be talking about what attitudes are and how we can measure them. So let's start off with attitudes in general before focusing on work attitudes. So a good definition, a good simple definition of an attitude is an evaluative belief about something, or the complete set of evaluative beliefs about something. The way that we evaluate something, whether being good or bad, is our attitude towards that. And that is what we call the attitude object. So I could have an attitude towards organizational behavior. I could have an attitude towards my school. I could have an attitude towards my supervisor. I can have an attitude towards anything, and those are my beliefs that evaluate how good or bad something is. And so these beliefs have a source, and this source is our thoughts and feelings about the attitude object. So if I've got a positive attitude, that means that I'm having positive thoughts or positive feelings about it, or negative, or, which is often the case, I've got a mixture of positive and negative, and they kind of counterbalance out, but generally it's either a little positive, little negative, maybe pretty neutral. But these thoughts and feelings are based on either direct or indirect experience with whatever the attitude object is. So my attitude towards my boss is primarily based on my experiences with my boss. Now, he might remind me of somebody, and I might use that past experiences with somebody that he reminds me of to shape my attitude. But generally, in normal situations, it's my experience with whatever the attitude object is that defines what my attitude should be. Now, an interesting way to understand attitudes is to think, it's called the ABC model of attitudes. It's kind of like there's three components. There's the affective component, that's affect means feelings, and then the C is cognitive, that means cognition, thoughts. So there's the thoughts and feelings, but attitudes are also closely related to behavior, because what I think and feel will influence what I do. So my attitudes will influence my behavior. Now, it goes the other direction as well. My behavior can influence my thoughts and feelings and my attitudes. For example, if I blow up at my children or something, and even if it's completely unjustified, I might think, oh, they must have done something really bad to justify my behavior, and so I will imagine that they did something really bad. And that way I can feel better about myself. So I can look at my behavior and figure out ways to justify it that will affect my feelings and thoughts, my affect and my cognition, and which is completely illogical and morally unjustified. But as humans, we often do those things. So that's why we talk about three components of attitudes: the affective, the behavioral, and the cognition, because our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all interrelated, and attitudes are a means by which we can understand how they are related. Now, what are some characteristics of attitudes in general? First of all, they're either positive or negative or neutral, but they're on this linear scale generally. It's the evaluation, we either evaluate things positively, neutral, or negative. So that's the first characteristic. Second thing is that they're stored in our memory and they're not always conscious. When they're conscious, our attitudes vary according to what the social context and our mood is too. So they're always inside of us, but we don't always think about them. And when we do think about them, they're not constant. Depending on who I'm with, what's happening, what my mood is, my attitude can be more positive or more negative towards the attitude object, even if the attitude object's not present with me. Now, certainly, when I'm interacting with the attitude object, if it's my boss or whatever, my attitude will depend an awful lot on how our interaction goes. Now, another characteristic of attitudes, which is especially important for organizational psychology, is that they're pretty easily measured. What we need to do is we need to ask somebody how much they agree with an evaluative statement, some statement that has some type of evaluation in it. And we could use like a 5-point Likert scale or Likert scale, and ask them to what degree do they agree or disagree with different statements. You could say, so if we're going to measure my attitude towards my boss, I could indicate on a 1 to 5 scale, how much do I agree with the statement? I like my boss. Yes, I like my boss very much. I'd give that a 5. My boss is a good person. Yeah, I think he makes some really good efforts to be a really good person. 5. My boss always acts fairly. Maybe not always, but usually I'll give him a 4 on that. And then we could take the average of those and we'd get an attitude. So that would be like on a 1 to 5 point scale, that'd be about a 4.67. So that's how we measure attitudes, is by generally asking a bunch of statements and finding out how much people agree with them. Now there's other ways of doing that too, but that's the most common in organizational psychology. Now let's talk about job-related attitudes. I'd like to present 4 job-related attitudes that are quite common. The first 2 are so common I've even put stars by them, because these are like the big ones that are measured time and time again. Thousands of studies have included them because they're so important. The first one is job satisfaction, and that measures how satisfied we are with our job. Do we like our job? And do we think our job's a good thing? Do we appreciate our job? Things like that. A second one, which is similar, is organizational commitment, which measures how committed we are to our organization. Now notice, job satisfaction focuses on the job, what I'm hired to do. Organizational commitment focuses on the organization that hired me. Now, I might not like my job, but I might really like the organization. Or it might be the other way, or I might not like either. But those are 2 really important attitudes, because in work, the job and the organization are really important. Now, another important job-related attitude is organizational justice, and later we'll have a whole chapter on justice issues. And that's how fair we think our organization is, and especially how fair we think the organization is treating us. And that is an important attitude, because as humans we're really sensitive to justice issues. And then a fourth work-related or job-related attitude is work engagement. And this is becoming a more and more important variable in organizational psychology, because it describes so well what we want to see happening in work-related subjects. So work engagement is basically the opposite of burnout. It's how engaging or fun, if you want to be a little less technical, we find our work. So these are 4 job-related attitudes that are quite common, and a lot of times studies will include one of these 4 type attitudes to see the effect of something like how does working at home affect job satisfaction or organizational commitment? Is it related to organizational justice? How's work engagement? Or under what condition or what types of people find work at home high in work engagement? So a lot of studies involve these job-related attitudes. So if you were doing a study, how would you measure job-related attitudes? Though here's a real simple approach. There in the research method, in a research methods class, we'd go into much more detail. But basically, first of all, you want to clearly define the construct we want to measure. Now, construct means this psychological variable, this phenomena that's happening inside our head that we want to measure. We've got to figure out what it is we want to measure, and then on a practical level, the best way to measure it is to find some measure that measures what we want that we've clearly defined. We want to find a psychometrically valid measure. A psychometrically valid measure means that it's been tested out so that we know what it really measures, that it measures the same thing when everybody responds to the items in the measure, that it doesn't vary too much over time, it doesn't depend on outside circumstances, but it's fairly consistent, it's valid and a reliable measure of what we have defined. So typically these are found in journal articles that you can download from your library, and a lot of times on Google Scholar Google Scholar will give you direct links to PDFs. And so a couple examples are for organizational commitment. If you, the most common measure of organizational commitment is Allen and Myers' 1990 study. And they define organizational commitment in a special way. And they found 3 subscales. They found subscales or subdimensions. They said there's an effective commitment. That's how much you like an organization. There's a continuance commitment. That's how much you need to stay at an organization, how much you need to continue there. And then there's the normative commitment. That's like the social norms or the other norms that you feel are causing you to stay there because it's the right thing. And if that was the type of organizational commitment that you were interested in measuring, you would want to use Allen and Myers' scale that they developed in this 1990 paper and is easily findable. Now, suppose you want to measure work engagement. And the most common work engagement scale is called the Utrecht Work Engagement Scale. Utrecht is a city in Holland, and it was developed by Schoefele et al. In 2002. And Schoefele was a burnout expert, and he said, well, what's the opposite of burnout? And he came up with this idea of work engagement, which is basically a fancy word for saying fun. How much fun do people have doing their job? What do they find really fun at their work? And the Utrecht Work Engagement Scale measures that. Now, it turns out that is just a great thing to measure because as a leader, as an influencer, if we can get people to have fun at work, we're doing them good. Life is a lot more enjoyable. They work harder. They're more creative. They give it more. It just has a lot of good outcomes for both the individual and organizations.